Hi, my name is George Clouston. I'm Head of Scientific Research at BeeHero, and this is Just Ask George.
Hey George, can you explain why remotely monitoring the vital signs of an overwintering colony can be so valuable for beekeepers?
Overwintering is a period of major concern for beekeepers. It's a critical stage in the life cycle of a colony, and typically there can be quite high overwintering losses. However, in colder climates in particular, it's also a time during which the beekeepers can't open the hives and look in to assess what's happening with the hives and how they're doing, because it's too cold to actually open the box and look inside, and it could have a damaging impact on the bees. So the ability to actually remotely detect how that colony is faring over the winter period is really very useful, and it will give the beekeepers advance warning of problems and issues before they actually start to pull the hives out and get them ready to move into the first pollination cycle, which is typically almonds. So how do we do that? So we do know that over winter, again in colder and temperate climates, the bees will cluster over winter. So they cluster together, and they do that to conserve energy and food stores. However, that cluster is not just a static ball of bees. It's a very active, dynamic cluster. So if the weather outside warms slightly, the cluster will expand a little bit, let airflow move. If the weather gets very, very cold, sub-zero temperatures, they'll tighten up and pack tightly together. So it's sort of expanding and contracting. Plus the cluster will move around the hive to access food stores. So it's not just a static ball of bees, it's an active, dynamic winter cluster. However, we can use our knowledge of that behaviour and the thermodynamics of the cluster to actually monitor what's happening in the hive. So we know the temperature profile in the cluster, and we have a sensor in there. So that sensor is picking up these temperature fluctuations as the cluster moves, expands and contracts. So for instance, if we've got a very large cluster and the temperature sensor is right in the centre of the cluster, you'll have a very static, fairly stable temperature. Smaller clusters, the sensor may be moving in and out of the cluster as it contracts, expands, moves around. So you're seeing this cluster smaller. It's actually because of that. So we can track this over time and build up a pattern and relate that. It's quite important actually to relate that to the external temperatures. So you see what happens when it gets cold to the cluster outside and so on. So by tracking that gives us an indication of both the size of the cluster and the health of the bees, and also, when the colonies, if the colony reaches very small or dead out stage, you get a situation where the temperature inside the hive is reflecting pretty much the temperature outside, but just a few degrees different. So, and by doing that on a regular basis, the beekeepers can then actually see, well, what's happening with my hives, what's the status, and they have an idea before they get to pull the hives out of overwintering and get them ready for pollination as to the status. Another useful area is obviously looking at audio, and this is a new area of research we're doing, where we can also track the audio of the bees during that winter period and relate that to size and strength of the colonies. And it also gives us the ability to, for instance, to examine different overwintering practices. So how do bees fare, for instance, if they're put into cold storage versus bees that are left outside, how do they fare in extreme conditions, etc. So, different overwintering practices, how and when to feed, and so on and so forth. So I think it's by monitoring the hives during this period, as well as tracking really what's happening, it's a tool we can use to actually investigate and develop good practices for managing overwinter.
If you have a question for George, feel free to email him at george@beehero.io. That's george@beehero.io, and we'll have him answer your question.